All right, now when it comes to setting interest rates, the RBA is tasked with not only keeping inflation under control, but also helping the economy achieve full employment. Sorry, I'll start that one again. All right, now when it comes to setting interest rates, the RBA is tasked with not only keeping inflation under control, but also helping the economy achieve full employment, which hasn't been an issue of late because the unemployment rate has remained stubbornly low at just over 4%. But with the latest labour force data revealing a shock reduction of 41,000 full-time jobs, could this be starting to change, and will it be enough of a concern for the RBA to consider cutting rates later this month? Joining us to discuss is CBA economist Harry Ottley. G'day, Harry. Welcome to the Savings Tip Jar.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Nice to have you on, Harry, for the first time. But before we jump into this interesting topic, do you have a savings tip for us?
I was thinking about this one, and I think I came down to partnering up with someone with a similar philosophy. My now wife Whitney was a much better saver than me before we met, and she really whipped me into shape. And I found that's been probably the best savings tip I've had.
Yeah, that's a good one, Harry. Also, probably a good bit of relationship advice as well. Is when you're looking for a partner, if you do happen to be single, any listeners out there, look for someone that isn't someone that spends like crazy, because you'll get sucked into that vortex. And it just helps when you are both on the same page with saving or spending. Obviously it can cause massive source of friction there when someone's trying to save money and then the other person's spending all the money. I think isn't it probably like the number one source of breakups is like finance stuff. Anyway, getting into the labour force data, shall we? This latest data drop from the ABS, I think it was last week, was a bit of a surprise, because I think most people were expecting like a big increase in jobs overall, but it actually had a slight increase. But the biggest thing, as mentioned in the intro there, was that big drop in full-time employment of nearly 41,000. What was your reaction to that, Harry?
Yeah, the labour force survey is an interesting one because it has so many different moving parts. So you've obviously got employment, the participation rate, and then the unemployment rate. And then within the employment numbers, as you touched on, you get the full-time, part-time split, and it can be really volatile. So in terms of the monthly moves in full-time versus part-time, I think if you looked at the month previous, it almost just reversed what happened in July. So we don't tend to put too much emphasis on the monthly moves in that sense. But I think overall you'd have to say it was a fairly weak report. We saw employment overall drop by around 5,000. That was obviously less than the market consensus. We also saw the participation rate fall by 0.2 percentage points to 66.8%. And so if we look at that and take that at face value, it is a little bit weaker than expected. But I think something that we like to do is look at the unemployment rate. It typically is a better indicator of the health of the labour market and tends to be more steady when these other parts of the survey are moving around. And on that front, it stayed at 4.2%. It's 4.24% to 2 decimal points, so getting close to 4.3%. But just because that stayed steady, I think it sort of blunted any major reaction to the labour force survey. And then if we look at things that try to account for some of this volatility, the ABS releases their trend numbers as well. And that's really what we look to gauge what's happening over a bit of a longer time period. And on that front, employment in trend terms is still increasing by around 18,000. The unemployment rate is around that 4.2, 4.3% level. And so as a result, we didn't take too much from it other than the fact that we have had a couple of weak prints now. And so if we get another one in September, I think that'll probably, or for the September data, that's probably when economists will start thinking, oh, maybe the labour market is weakening a little bit more quickly than we expected.
Yeah, for sure. Interesting what you guys both said there around the underemployment rate increasing and like the loss of full-time jobs. It seemed like for ages, the underemployment rate was at like historic lows. If you could get a job, it was likely to be a full-time job and you weren't looking for any more hours. Is this more of like a rebalancing of the market? And what does this mean for, the economy going forward?
Well, actually, if you look at the unemployment rate, it's sort of drifting higher. But curiously, at the moment, the underemployment rate is actually falling. So even though, as I said, kind of the full-time, part-time split can be a bit volatile, but if we look at the underemployment rate, which is, people that have a job but want more hours, it's been coming down. And so if we combine the unemployment rate and the I'll start again. If we look at the underemployment rate and the unemployment rate together, that gives us what we call the underutilization rate. You can see why people think that economists use overuse jargon, but basically the underutilization rate is the broadest measure of labour market slack because it includes unemployment and underemployment. And because they're kind of counteracting each other, it's sort of staying steady. So that's another reason why we weren't too worried about the report, because the underutilization rate, as I said, the broadest measure of labour market slack, is moving sideways. And the RBA has made a point of, looking at multiple indicators, sort of a broad suite of different indicators of labour market tightness. And if we look at that underutilization rate remaining steady, it actually indicates that we're not seeing a massive loosening. And so the headline figures suggest that there is a bit of a weakening going on, and that is our broader view that it is softening a little bit. But if you look under the hood, the labour market remains in a really pretty solid position, especially if we think historically. And for that reason, we don't think it changes any near-term, any near-term views on the RBA. What we're really starting to think about is if we get a few more months of this low employment and the unemployment rate rising, that's when we'd sort of start considering a more considerable weakening in conditions. But at the moment, things are still tracking pretty well.
Yeah, we have heard a few headlines over the last couple of weeks of some big job losses at some big companies lately. So I'm curious to see what the next set of labour force data reveals, and perhaps if we do see a few more of those, we'll start to it'll make the RBA a bit nervous. But, you mentioned economic jargon. Here's another one to throw at the listeners. The NAIRU, which economists like to talk about sometimes, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. I'm curious to know if are we currently at that rate, like, the low fours at the moment. I think people previously thought it was perhaps a bit higher, maybe closer to 5% for unemployment to not be too low to be actually causing faster inflation. But with inflation starting to come down quite a bit or seeming to be somewhat steady, do you think this kind of low 4%, what is it, 4.2 we're at, that is the NAIRU at the moment?
Yeah, our view is that we don't have a point estimate in the way that the RBA might talk about it, but our view is, yes, broadly we're around the current level of full employment. And really that's because, to your point, if you look at the evidence suggests that inflation is coming back to target. We've seen wages growth come off, and that is enough for us to think that we're around that level of full employment. Where the RBA differs on that view is they think it's around 4.5%. So we're obviously getting close to that now, but still they would characterize the labour market as having some tightness is the way they're kind of framing it. And that implicitly means that they think the NAIRU is still a little bit higher than the current unemployment rate. But if you dig into how they sort of estimate these things, they use these complicated models that use a lot of data from back to the 80s, and they just essentially take time to for that to flow through to the NAIRU coming down. And because of that, we need sort of a few years of data for them to be confident that the NAIRU has sustainably come back down to maybe the low fours. And they're not confident enough to yet to go out and say, yep, the NAIRU is at this level. They have to sort of trust their models, and the models take time to adjust. But I think if we have this conversation in, 2 years' time, and we did get inflation back to target with the unemployment rate around the current levels, you'll probably see their models continuing to come down, and then they'll be more comfortable with saying, yes, the NAIRU is in the low fours and around the current level. But they have to be cautious because they don't want to get caught on the hop if turns out that their models are right and then inflation does re-accelerate. And so it just takes them time to shift their views, which I think is understandable, where market economists have the advantage of being able to be much more nimble and say, based on the current data, we think the NAIRU is this. But obviously there's a lot of uncertainty around this, but our view just is that, the evidence at the moment suggests that it is around the current level, and that's obviously a really good thing because it means we can run a lower unemployment rate than in previous cycles. It means more people in work, and that's broadly a very good news story.
Now, Harry, where I'm interested in this is the public versus private sector. I think in the past couple of years, the public sector employment growth has done a lot of heavy lifting, both state and federal level and local level as well. And it seems just like anecdotally, a lot of the jobs going and friends getting jobs are in the public sector or like public related, non-market sector is what they call it. And then I guess the hope is that governments are hoping that there's a natural flow back to the private sector. Is this taking place, or is it yet to really take hold?
Yeah, so this is the key sort of theme in the labour market at the moment, and it really is about this non-market story. So it does get confusing because the non-market sector is not necessarily the public sector in the way that you would think of working for a state government, as a bureaucrat, for example. But non-market sectors are health, education, and public administration, and you don't necessarily need to work for the government, but an interesting or a clear way to frame it is that if you work in the non-public sector, generally your job is government aligned in some way. Obviously, the NDIS is the most pertinent example of this and has been over the last few years, where you might work for yourself or you might work for a private company, but the package comes from the NDIS of the people that you're helping in that job. And so without the government funding there, you wouldn't have the job. So you don't work for the government, but it's government aligned. And we've had this story of strong government spending, which has been well covered. That's obviously related to things like the NDIS and the care economy more broadly, so aged care, childcare, etc. And that's really dragging a lot of people into the workforce just due to the level shift in investment in those areas. And so what we had as interest rates went up is this really strange situation where the economy slowed, interest rates went up, and yet employment remained really strong. And that came down to these government aligned jobs. And that's now slowing, to your point. It's slowing probably more quickly than we expected. And this is really goes to our main risk with the labour market and risk to the economy more broadly, is if it continues to slow as this sort of levels adjustment in the care economy phases out and we get more into a normal sort of trend in terms of spending. If the non-market sector job slows more quickly than the market sector can pick up to absorb that slack, we might see the unemployment rate rise more than what we expect. But at the moment, what we're seeing is the non-market sector is slowing, the market sector is picking up, not picking up quite quick enough to keep the unemployment rate steady. And that's kind of why we've seen this slow grind higher in 2025 so far, but we're not too far away from that level where it keeps it steady. So overall, the transition's going well. But if that transition becomes unorderly and the market sector slows a little bit, that's where you might see the slack emerge in the economy and in the labour market, and the unemployment rate drift a little bit higher than what we and the RBA expect. And that's really the main mechanism where we might see more interest rate cuts in 2026. It's not our base case, but that's kind of where we could see it happening.
Yeah, it's certainly one to watch the labour force data over the coming months to see if any of that changes. Harry Ottley, really appreciate your time on the Savings.com podcast. Thanks so much for your insights.
No worries. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Harry.
All right.